welcome to our vlog. And today I'm talking with Max Wade, Doctor of Philosophy in Philosophy. That's never redundant at all. From Boston College. Your dissertation was in Platonists' ontology of artifacts. I wanted to talk to you after talking to a mutual friend of ours who's been on the show, Tim Schatz, that I wanted to make ancient philosophy both understandable and weird again. And you seem to be a prime candidate for that. I talked about it in terms of 19th century philosophy and their particular reading of the ancient philosophers. And this has also come up somewhat infamously in a very public debate between Benjamin Studebaker and Chris Cutrone, friend of the show and frenemy of the show, respectively, where I agreed with Studebaker's accusations of Cutrone not actually making his case well, but I actually didn't disagree with his case. And the reason why is even if Marx thought he was an Epicurean, which I don't know that he did, but I'm doing a whole series on Daniel Tutt about materialism and Marxism and how Marxist materialism is different. But even as Marx thought he was an Epicurean, he was an Epicurean as read through Hegel, as read through the Project of German Philology and Philosophy, which means he was not an Epicurean. And I wanted to get into that with you. I've talked a lot about the idealists and how absolutely strange we might actually find ancient idealism, and how another thing I'm gonna throw out in my front loading before I let you talk. Sorry, Max. Is that in studying ancient philosophy and non-Abrahamic religions, I do not know why we pretend the concept of religion actually makes a lot of sense outside of Abrahamic traditions, and I'm not even sure it makes that much sense there. And two, in all seriousness, the ancient philosophies were religions in the broader sense of that term, if that term has any meaning, which I will admit sociologically and anthropologically, I'm not sure it does. But there were not just like ethical commitments in these texts. And my big frustration has been the secularization of Socrates and Plato, as well as the complete misunderstanding of the Stoics in popular philosophy, but even in some academic philosophy. But that brought me also to thinking about, okay, well, what is materialism for Marx? How is it different from materialism the way it's understood in, say, analytic philosophy today? But also, what the hell was materialism for Atomists and Democritus and the Epicureans? Because it doesn't really seem to be the same thing we mean by the word. So I wanted to ask you, in the ancient world, what were the most common ontologies and metaphysical beliefs? At least let's just start with ancient Greece. We're not going to talk about everywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me on. There's a lot in that introduction. We could probably spend a single episode on any one of those things. So hopefully we can get to most of it. If not, more for later. Perhaps.
You can come back. Like every now and then I have to stop talking about how it feels like the world is ending, and that's when I talk about philosophy. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, we can talk about how the world ends many times in the ancient world. But yeah, I mean, I definitely share a sort of similar approach or sort of interest in ancient philosophy. I think the way to make it relevant is to make it weird, to not sort of treat it as a kind of given that these people are going to see the way that we would see them, that the concepts and even terms they're using are going to have a natural one-to-one with how we do. In fact, more often they don't. And so making this stuff much more unfamiliar, really checking our assumptions at the door, does help us see stuff that's really, really interesting, I think. So you asked a question about ontologies. And so I'll sort of start there. I think bracketing some more minority schools like the skeptics or others, I genuinely think there's a sort of division we can make between sort of two basic camps in the sort of ancient and Hellenistic world. I'm more of a Hellenist here, so I'll sort of talk about like kind of Hellenistic and Roman philosophy. I think that's sort of where my natural sort of position is. But we can see people who really trace their origins back to Socrates and people who trace their origins to Democritus. So basically, on one hand, Plato, Neoplatonists, Middle Platonists, Aristotelians, and Stoics, I see as actually all being in basically one and the same camp. They have many differences. I'm not trying to sort of paper over it too much, but I do think they have a sort of shared set of basic assumptions that are fundamentally different than how Epicureans and other kind of non-standard materialists think about things. And that's not really necessarily a mainstream view, but I can certainly defend it on a number of points. I think the way to think about this, one of the kind of keys to thinking about ancient philosophy often, is that Miriology, so for those of you who are familiar, it's Miros is just the Greek word for part, the study of parts and wholes. The relationship between parts and wholes is kind of, I'm not going to say it's sort of the skeleton key that unlocks a lot of ancient philosophy, but it's way more important than I think most people would expect. How do parts relate to wholes is a really kind of fundamental ontological question that gets actually kind of dropped out quite a bit when we get to modern philosophy. So to sort of sketch out briefly my sort of basic position on this, Platonists, Aristotelians, and Stoics are all going to agree that in various different forms of assenting to this, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole has a level of reality that is prior to that of the parts. So when we think about, just we'll take a human being, it's usually kind of an easier example. It's the whole thing. Then from that, we get the various differentiation into parts. So it's not that you see me as, a set of organ systems or, matter and form. There's first this sort of unified subject, which you then can break down into its constituent parts. The atomistic tradition is going to say the parts can produce the whole, the parts are prior to the whole. And in that sense, I think there's a sort of fundamental difference in perspective.
So this sort of like structural ontology, and this is one thing that I've tried to get people to understand back a long time ago when I used to still teach philosophy, which I haven't done even to high schoolers in over a decade. I used to teach philosophy to Mexican high school students. I would point out that to understand Plato and to understand a lot of the ancients, you had to understand their notions of math, but that their notions of math, A, were weirder and more religious than ours, and B, they were not based off of like the idea of math as a universal language because they didn't use numbers the way we did. It was based off of forms, and that was analogous specifically to geometry. So I guess this does bring me to the kind of two problems that you kind of have with talking about ancient materialist and modern materialist. Like the question for modern materialist is often whether or not there's anything supernatural, or whether or not that phrase is even a coherent phrase to utter. Yeah. Like, now I would find this interesting for like when we talk about the ancient Stoics who were holistic, but they were materialist in that they believed that even the gods were made out of matter, and that ultimately they were also a manifestation of one god. It was kind of also made out of matter. And that is hard for me to get across. Now, it does actually matter in early modern philosophy because Hobbes was also one of these weird people who was an utter materialist who also believed in some kind of Christian God, although albeit a highly heretical one by anyone's standard. And he does seem to have believed that God was a literal material being, if I'm reading him correctly, and no one's been able to disprove that to me. So this is an interesting, problem. Now you talk a lot about, ontology in your dissertation about Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism, but I wanted to get into this because so the debate between like the atomists and the Epicureans and the other forms on what we might call metaphysical ontology, to just combine two words together. So what is the nature of being and what is the nature of what grounds physics? It is very different from our natural supernatural dichotomy.
Yeah.
Would that distinction would even make sense to ancient people? Like, I've actually wondered this. I don't know. So do you know?
Yeah. This really comes up a lot, and especially in like discussions of like ancient theories of magic, ancient theories of astrology, things like that. Also stick to Plotinus. That's kind of my core, but I think it's really illustrative here. Plotinus has a very funny attitude toward magic. He basically thinks it's almost as mundane a skill as farming. You're using certain kind of technical skills to manipulate natural processes to get desired results. The farmer does it with plants. The magician does it with spells, but it's essentially the same thing. You're just using non-apparent features of the natural world to get results for human ends. Pliny the Elder is a sort of good barometer for sort of more popular attitudes about this. He's not a philosopher, but he sort of a para-philosopher of the Roman period. He's trying to do his own version of sort of Roman popular philosophy at times. And he says, oh yeah, magic's awful. It's this foreign thing that comes in from the East. But he admits plenty of things that we would immediately identify as supernatural. He doesn't think that magic doesn't exist. He just thinks it's like bad because it's bad to sort of pursue human ends over that of nature. But when the Vestal Virgin can make people freeze and fall down, that's not magic. That's just divinely ordained, what we call supernatural kinds of powers. And so our boundaries of sort of religion and supernatural, these things can be really fuzzy and not map on neatly to our concepts. You mentioned the Stoics believing in material physical gods. You'd be hard pressed to find a Greek who doesn't think this in some sense. Let's not forget Plotinus, this thinker of the one, these kind of grand metaphysical principles. For him, the heavenly bodies are gods. They are the gods in the material world. They're not reducible to their bodies. They're not exclusively their bodies. They have divine souls that are why they exist. But, you can look up in the stars and see the gods. They're not hidden from you, at least in that sense. So we should also be perhaps surprised or find it a bit weird when Epicureans, on the other hand, deny the divinity of the heavenly bodies. They just think that they're the same size they appear to be, which is one of the weirdest Epicurean positions. I think it's really a problem for them historically because it's so obviously not true. You get these hilarious arguments in Lucretius where he's like trying to get away from the fact that Epicurus has committed them to this. But later Epicureans call Epicurus Soter, savior. He is the person who is basically a messiah figure who liberates humanity from all the fear of death and things like that. He's basically divine. They call him divine that, Lucretius does many times. And I think we should take that seriously. It's not just praising their founder. Epicurus, in the mind of later Epicureans, is godlike. And for reasons that we can probably get into more down the road. But again, the boundaries between sort of what we call supernatural and natural, plenty of things that we call supernatural, the ancients find mundane. It's not surprising in their mind that the various heavenly bodies are going to have effects that we can then predict through astrology. I sort of make this point to people. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it. You know, us as moderns, we will certainly admit that some heavenly bodies are going to have effects on the earth. You know, the sun warms it, the moon affects tides. For the ancients, it's weird that we stop just there. You know, why just those two? Why not all the rest? And why shouldn't those effects be predictable through various forms of systematic, mathematized, predictive models? So things that we consider obviously supernatural or not obviously supernatural, and the boundaries for them between sort of licit and illicit magical practices, things that would sort of fall under that umbrella, it has often more to do with where is it coming from? Is it sort of seen as a foreign imposition or a sort of foreign influence, or if it's domestic and sort of sanctioned by popular religion? And by and large, the sort of natural, supernatural distinction is going to be something that you don't really see a clear version of, in large part, and this I think might be a good segue to talk about, in large part because the gods are not really, at least in philosophical camps, seen as actively engaging in the worldly affairs. They're always involved in worldly affairs, but not in a way that requires special intervention. And in fact, generally the Greek attitude is the gods should not really be concerned with human affairs. It's kind of gross to think about the gods as being caring directly about what we get up to. Much more Abrahamic way of seeing things.
I mean, this is interesting though, because even the Abrahamic way of seeing things, when you parse out ancient thought, like I've always talked about, like, okay, you want to talk about successors of the Greeks, and I'm like, well, it's, and even the Neoplatonics, I'm like, it's Gnostics, it's actually any sort of Jewish mysticism. It's because Jews also ancient Judaic peoples also saw the material universe as pretty much the ground basis of reality. When they talk about resurrection, they mean it literally. They don't mean it as some like metaphor of the body arising. And this seems to have come out of a logic problem that they split this out in response to Neoplatonism's concept of what forms were, kind of translated into a Near Eastern, North African context. And that leads some interesting things when we talk about what materialism is. I've actually tried to like break down a modern materialism. Like, people talk about it as if it's clear what they mean. Sort of infamously, I've been reading China Mieville and Richard Seymour, on this from Britain, and they've had this like crisis of materialism, but then honestly, and consciousness too. But honestly, their definitions of consciousness, even though they pointed it out that they were equivocating, they couldn't stop equivocating in the text between like different meanings of the term that aren't actually all that related. But I found this true of materialism. Like, when most people mean materialism, they, in a modern scientific context, they mean naturalism, that everything it is natural and is under natural law. And natural law is an emergent scientific fact. As opposed to what natural law meant even in the early modern period, which was it was a scientific fact because God made it that way. And then the other thing they mean is ultimate substance monism. And yet this gets quite vague, even in modern thought, of whether or not the substance monism is actual matter or whether or not it's energy. And then what do you mean by energy, since energy is just a potential to do work? And that, you know, I have scientists who will respond, this is absolutely obviously clear. And I'm like, actually, it's not. It's not clear at all. And that's the kind of playground that people like Zizek will pick up on.
Yeah.
When you get to someone like Marx, who's reading Epicurus through Hegel, and Hegel's reading the ancients through this German philosophy and philology project, which is very much, it actually has a specific geopolitical context and competition with the kind of Romanism of the British. And this is a like almost an ideological myth that the Prussian, specifically Academy, is coming up with to unify German culture and create another idea of Europe based on the ancient Greeks. Now, it's not that the ancient Greeks weren't important. Like I just said, they're super important to like pretty much everything Abrahamic. You really have a hard time understanding medieval thought without understanding some conceptions of Plato and Aristotle. I mean,
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, basically until like the 20th century, you had to contend with everything Aristotle said, no matter how batshit crazy it was. Even by ancient standards. So take it back to you to this point here, though, about these different forms. What is at stake between these thinkers who think that there's a gestalt whole, be it the one or the many or whatever, if we talk about the pre-Socratics, whatever the underlying physical substance is? Because I do want to bring this up to like some modern thinking. When a lot of Western thinkers, I'm gonna use that in quotation marks because even I don't always know what we mean by it. Western thinkers, so let's just say in the European and Islamic world, and I'm going to include the Islamic world because I think excluding it, there are substantive differences, but they're both descendants of this like ancient classical milieu.
Yeah.
When they hit something like Buddhism, people are like amazed. You mean these people like don't think gods are important, but they think that they're real, but they don't think ontology has anything to do with this grounding of being in a deity? And I'm like, if you look at ancient Greek thought, neither than most of them too. I mean, like it's like it was my understanding from Buddhism and coming over to Buddhism going like, oh, this is not as weird as moderns make it out to be. Like this is kind of the baseline of most of the Hellenistic and pre-Hellenistic Greek philosophical schools. But there is a stake, like just like there's a stake between Buddhist on Atman and non-Atman and emptiness and substance. There does seem to be a stake between the people who think the whole comes first versus the people who think division comes first. So what is the stake?
Yeah. Whew, lots to pick up on there. One thing I think I actually kind of want to address first, and maybe sort of then get into this whole part distinction, is sort of in passing, you mentioned the notion of sort of like incorporeals, incorporeal powers and stuff. I think this is I think where people kind of classify Stoics and Epicureans as materialists together. I think this might be a good thing to kind of get cleared up first, address this, and sort of get into a little bit more detail. For Plato, Aristotle, and the people following from them, so pretty much all of the medievals are going to agree with them on this. You need incorporeal entities to exist as a explanation for physics to work at all. To give a very, very sort of brief version of the argument,
kind of like we need dark matter to exist for physics to work and all, but go ahead.
In my mind, that is a clear indication of these secularized versions of basically ancient philosophical things. That's a whole other tirade. I don't need to get into that. But basically, the very, very short intuition is that for the Platonist and Aristotelian, in this sense, they're basically kind of one and the same, bodies on their own are going to run out of energy. Energy, it's a sort of negative, it's a negatively entropic system, to sort of perhaps muddy the terms a little bit here. But if you leave bodies to their own devices, they will run out of energy on their own. So you need something that's constantly inputting energy into the system. And for the Platonist and Aristotelian, that has to be something incorporeal, it has to be something immaterial. So for Aristotle, that's the unmoved movers, the things that move the heavenly bodies, and that gives you everything on earth. For Platonists, it's sort of even further. It's really, if you were to get rid of the forms and the intelligible principles, everything would just disintegrate basically immediately, because that's the only thing that gives bodies their existence. Yeah. Aristotle you could probably feasibly read as having that position as well, but neither here nor there. The Stoics, by our standards, by most standards, especially, again, this consciousness-focused standard of materialism, are materialists. Because they think that insofar as incorporeals do exist, Stoics do acknowledge the existence of incorporeals in some really weird ways, only bodies are causally efficacious things. So for Stoics, for something to be able to produce an effect, it has to be a body. So in that sense, incorporeals are invoked in order to understand how things like predication and like logic works. But by and large, you're not using incorporeal things to explain your physics for a Stoic. And similar for Epicureans. The kind of incorporeal things for Epicureans are going to be more epistemological. So like the status of like the images that come off of bodies. Again, very sort of tricky kind of questions to ask about what those things actually are. It's not really clear to me what they are. But in any case, Epicureans and Stoics don't think you need to invoke incorporeal things in order to explain why the world doesn't run out of energy. Platonists and Aristotelians do. And that's why the medievals like it, because there's a reason why almost all medieval philosophers invoke cosmological arguments for the existence of God. It's a physical problem. And God is the solution to a very clear physical problem of why doesn't the world run out of energy? And you get this, in early Jewish philosophy, like Saadia Gaon, he's making this exact argument for why the world can't be eternal, things like that. Mm-hmm. So as early as like the 900s, these arguments are getting very clearly drawing on this intuition. So to sort of bring it back to this question of materialism, for the ancients, when we're defining materialism, we don't need to invoke consciousness. As much as I love, this would be a slightly odd name to invoke here, but Quentin Meillassoux, I think he's in some ways actually still underrated philosopher, despite the sort of buzz.
The unlimited materialist who is like going to be the gateway between analytic and continental philosophy about 15 years ago.
Yeah,
I remember him.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think he has been sort of given his full dues, because I actually do think he really hits the nail on the head in some actually really important ways I don't think have been fully grappled with. Conversation for another time. But he's dealing with this in a post-Kantian way. His idea of materialism is thought comes posterior to matter. Matter exists prior to and is the conditions of thinking. Very succinct sort of modern materialist framework, but kind of incoherent for ancient philosophy. In no small part because sort of what's meant by like the subject and thinking for ancients is not the same as we get in the modern period. So when we think about ancient materialism, bracket off all this stuff about consciousness. I actually generally don't like to talk about consciousness because I don't really know what it even is. And I think using it as our like sort of standard for what we mean by materialism is going to mean that we have to now start talking about consciousness. And I think that is going to inherently lead to a conversation that bakes in more assumptions than it does clarify. So in my mind, what is ancient materialism? Mm-hmm. What's the distinction actually here? It's a question of, is matter, whatever school we're talking about is going to define as matter, is that something that's an active or a passive principle? And this, I think, follows along the demarcation I made initially. For Platonists, Aristotelians, and Stoics, the thing that they call matter is passive. It is the thing that is shaped. It is the thing that is malleable. It is the thing that responds to whatever active, and they usually identify active principles with the divine. Certainly true for at least all three of those. Plato, Aristotle, Stoics. The active principle is the divine force in the world that works like a craftsman to shape matter into various determinate forms. So matter is not the explanation for why things happen. It's the substrate. Hule is the word that Aristotle uses. It's wood. It's the thing that's shaped into a particular form. For Plato and the Platonists, matter isn't even shaped at all. It's more of like a mirror where things appear in it. Matter is so absolutely passive for the Platonists that it doesn't even change, doesn't become anything else. So they cannot be materialists because they don't think that matter is the cause of why I am like a thinking thing, or why I act, or this or that. It's the underlying substrate. To be an ancient materialist, you have to reject that premise. And that's why I think the Stoics are ultimately not materialists. The Stoics would say, oh yeah, no, we're corporealists. The only things that produce any kind of effect are bodies. So we don't need to invoke anything incorporeal to explain reality. But they would not call themselves materialists because matter is passive. Matter is just a thing that is being shaped by God, like quite literally. I mean, Diogenes Laertius, this chronicler of various ancient philosophical views, he says, yeah, the Stoics think that ultimately there's sort of two principles in the world. God, which is this pneumatic fire that shapes the world, and matter, the body of God that's being shaped. You know, matter for the Stoics is still passive. Matter is not the active principle at work in the world. This is what is different about the Epicureans. And this is why I think they're the only genuine materialist school in ancient philosophy. They consider matter to be the passive principle. Matter is what gives rise to the various different forms of things that we see. It's the principles or motions or activities of matter that then give rise to more complex phenomena. And I think that's really the really crucial distinction I kind of would like to hammer home for a lot of people, is that we're not thinking about minds. I mean, minds are related to this. We can sort of talk about minds, but it's the subject almost always comes after that. You know, we're really not thinking from the perspective like Descartes, sense certainty or the grounding of mind. It's what is the active principle? What's the passive principle? And for the Epicureans, they don't even really use this language. You know, they don't talk about matter in no small part because hule or the chora, which is what Plato would call matter, these are terms that imply passivity, imply lack of agency, lack of generativity. Things are being, you know, matter is something that's shaped for all these sort of things that trace themselves back to Socrates, basically. We can talk about the pre-Socratics, but that's, I think, a good place, at least for the later schools and the kind of division that I'm making.
So the fundamental thing to look at when we talk about this, for example, is that what we tie up in modern materialism, and even bracketing out consciousness, because you're right. Consciousness is a hard problem, even in the sense of I don't know how we all consistently define it. So for example, like, is consciousness in the brain, or is it embodied, or is it emergent? It partly depends on what you think the primary sense organ is, and how you think causation to that organ and where it is processed is. And that actually has not been solved by physical science yet. And what physical science currently indicates is weird in a way that almost can't be true, which is the idea that you actually have made a decision and maybe are even conscious of that decision before it registers in the brain as electrical activity. And yeah, problem. But one of the things I find very interesting, you know, and bringing it up to why I care so much about ancient stuff as a proxy for caring about modern stuff, is that this consciousness debates in Marxism. I'm like, well, none of you have defined what you mean by materialism. It's like when I used to deal with the skeptics movement and the aughts, and they all talk about rationality, and I'm like, which rationality? You talk about rationality as if it is too generously obvious, which means you have no idea what it is. Like, do you mean the circular rationality of the economic market? Do you mean predicate logic? Do you mean modal logic? Do you mean mathematical coherence? Do you mean linguistic coherence? Those all can flame under the words rational. Those aren't the same thing. And, you know, when I bring this up in like the realm of politics and stuff, even political theory, people would be like, well, this is not important. I'm like, it kind of is, though. About, you know, my big example is like, there's a lot of people who are hyper determinist materialists who are also like political radicals, and I don't understand. I mean, other than the fact that by their logic they couldn't help but be that way anyway. But I'm just like, you know, unless you believe eschatologically almost that this is the way things have to go, and that you are just fulfilling something that you have to do, and I guess your belief doesn't matter because you believe it anyway. I don't understand why you'd have any politics derived if you really believe that. Because what sort of norm can you impose on something that it doesn't matter what your norm is? Everything's going to unflow in a certain way because of the random movement of the Big Bang. I have no idea. Conversely, in Marxism, and where you have to talk about ancient stuff, is me trying to explain why certain Trotskyist and Marxist-Leninist sects reject the Big Bang has to do with arguments from Aristotle. And their notions of dialectics and eternity going back to Aristotle and 18th, 19th century understandings of that even. And it's very weird to insist on that with modern people today because it is a philosophical argument masquerading as a scientific one. But then so are most of the Big Bang related. I mean, like my big thing right now that I haven't talked about in about 10 years, but in studying the ancients, I started like thinking about things like, okay, so we are assuming that math implies the existence of entities. And you have deduced entire entities that actually don't really correspond with your physics to make it up. And you have worked out an elaborate metaphysical system in things like M theory and brain theory, which even with all the problems of falsification of probability, there's no way to probabilistically or falsifiably Popperianly check those theories. There's none. I don't even know that you could experimentally do it without destroying the universe if they were right. So, how do you know you are not just assuming things off of a web of coherence and retrojecting it back? Because we know from ancient philosophy, people did. Modern people will drop this stuff out because it seems embarrassing to them. But I'm also fascinated by this stuff. When I explained, for example, Aristotle, I did some explainers in Aristotle back in the day and on Aristotle's politics. But I was like, you have to understand Aristotle's metaphysical conceptions to understand what he's prioring, because he's assuming these forms, even though he's not a formist like Plato. I'm not saying that, but he's assuming these forms parallel each other because the natural world parallels. And that's an assumption off of understandability. And then there's also the ways in which he's basing like his teleology and what makes an organism coherent based off of assumptions of, well, the unmoved mover would only waste energy on something that is unique. So everything must have some unique function because we can't have wasted energy, because why would the unmoved mover, which isn't really a consciousness, I don't think, at least, knock on wood, it might be. I'm going to be careful in what I say about what Aristotle actually thought about what the unmoved mover was. But there's a certain amount of coherence and energy logic and all this that goes into this that actually is fairly rationally adroit. Like, it's just, you have to take those first assumptions, which is one of the things I used to argue when I used to argue with the skeptics movements. And they're like, oh, well, philosophy, we don't do philosophy, we do physics. I'm like, oh, yes, you do philosophy. Like, what you consider a cutoff between a thing and energy is a philosophical question, believe it or not. So, and to bring this back to the ancient world, because this is my whole, like, why do we care about this? I think it's important to understand the difference between passive and active substance, and then corporality versus non-corporality or corporality. Because I think in the modern discussions about like supernaturalism, for example, in ancient ways of framing that's a corporalist versus non-corporalist thought. Like, that's not actually about materialism. Like,
yeah, exactly.
All right. So what else do we misunderstand? I mean, like, so the Epicureans, there's been a lot of trying to reclaim Epicurus. I guess we went through our Stoics and we had to go to the other one. And I've been very suspicious of this, again, because my background and like knowing and understanding Buddhist philosophy has clued me in on certain Epicurean things. And it's not because I think Epicureanness was like some secret form of Buddhism or some shit. I think these were based off of convergent logical systems, based off certain assumptions of unity or disunity and physicality that had ethical and political and all kinds of implications. I mean, I guess for Epicureans it would be ethical and anti-political, but it's interesting to think about. And it's also hard to explain, for example, like the Cyrenaics, my favorite weird group that everyone forgets. And everyone's like, oh, the Cyrenaics, they're so radical hedonists. I'm like, what? But who would have? I'm like, and most people thought they were true heirs to Socrates, buddy. Like, why? It's it's not what you think it is. It has to do with this questioning logic and notions of what is already innate, and why that is the way it is. And while we don't know that much about the Cyrenaics, we don't have that much left of their own writings, if there ever were. Actually, if they were ever extant in the first place, because I'm not sure that we know that they were. We know that they existed, but we don't know that they wrote anything down.
Yeah.
I have found that, like, when you get into those weird categories, or another example, maybe we can use this to get back to Epicurus. I realized in listening to, believe it or not, a podcast, the history of what is it? The history of Western colonialism. I forget what it is. And then also listening to another podcast, the history of philosophy without any gaps. But the secret history of Western esotericism, which is weirdly actually a philosophy podcast, which people don't expect. But when I realized like how much symbolic cosmology is in Plato's Politics, and that we don't have the keys to all of it, and that this also has like metaphysical hints to what Plato and or maybe Socrates, asterisk, probably not Socrates, thought. And that's been interesting to trying to deal with, because when you talk to modern Marxists, a lot of times they do take their cues from German idealism, which is fine, but they take German idealist readings of this or that at face value. And I don't think you can do that. So, for example, what do we know about the physical assumptions beyond the holisticness of Plato?
Yeah. I think one thing actually might be even sort of interesting to sort of address in a slightly different angle is, you mentioned Socrates. I think actually one of the most interesting things we can say about Socrates, and this is a atypical Socrates, it's not the Socrates that people normally focus on, is that if you want to think about Socrates in the context of what he really changes from the pre-Socratics, is, and this is something that's in both Plato and Xenophon. Not enough people read Xenophon. I'll sort of bang that drum a lot too. Not enough people read Xenophon. Xenophon Socrates is actually the primary Socrates for both the Stoics and John Stuart Mill. Funny enough, John Stuart Mill read Xenophon before reading Plato. So just interesting sort of footnote historically.
I often do the whole triangulation thing and go, if it's in both Xenophon and Plato, it might be true.
I don't know why that's not seen as a more like common assumption, but people sort of don't like that in Socrates studies. But that's just, for me, I'm still yet to sort of understand why that's the case. But it's something really interesting that comes up in both Plato and Xenophon on this point, and I think it's pretty reasonable to say this comes from Socrates. Socrates seems to avoid talking about natural philosophy pretty much writ large in both Xenophon and Xenophon and Plato. And I think that, at least I find the arguments for this kind of compelling, that this stems from Socrates seeing natural philosophy as, again, what we call science or something kind of like that, now, as being fundamentally incapable of explaining final causes or whys, purposes in the world. Socrates, David Sedley wrote a book on this called Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity. Highly recommend it. Really sort of changed my opinion on a lot of this. It seems like Socrates is kind of a creationist reactionary response to pre-Socratic natural philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-Socratic natural philosophy is explaining the transformation among elements, why different sort of elementary bodies, and already probably presuming too much to say that, but how different elements produce the plenitude that we experience in the world. Socrates sort of pulls back and says, well, we need to invoke divine design in order to explain nature. So there's two really interesting passages in Xenophon's Memorabilia where Socrates is coming out swinging, basically, against the view that we can explain things without invoking divine design, without invoking kind of cosmic mind. And you get the same exact thing in Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates talks about how he heard the books of Anaxagoras being read in the square, Anaxagoras being this pre-Socratic philosopher. Anaxagoras has this idea that you had all the different seeds of things that were sort of unmixed. There's this cosmic mind that mixes it all together, and then that's how you get all of reality. What that means, probably a bit unclear both then and now. In any case, Socrates says, oh, that's great, but it doesn't explain why I am here now. Okay, my body's in various configurations, but why is Socrates here in prison being put to death? It seems like Socrates, in both Plato and Aristotle, needs to invoke some kind of final cause, some kind of purposiveness to nature in order to explain why things are the way that they are. And because Socrates is pretty clear, I don't talk about natural philosophy. When Plato writes the Timaeus, Socrates talks about Atlantis and the stories in the Republic, and then when the actual natural philosophy comes, he punts and gives it to this Pythagorean, who's going to then expound this what we get in the actual Timaeus itself. But what's still there is a divine demiurge shaping the world based on forms. Divine design is still present, even when Socrates sort of takes the foot off the gas and has someone else explain it. So it seems like there's this thread of this kind of need to invoke some kind of divine craftsmanship, some divine design that Socrates brings back into natural philosophy. You get this in the Stoics. The Stoics call the world soul a craftsman. The world soul works on its own body like a craftsman, does intentionally designing everything in the world. Mm-hmm. Aristotle, Plato, it's all there. It's not there in the Epicureans. The Epicureans wholesale reject all arguments from design. There's all these wonderful passages in Book 5 of Lucretius where he is giving all these examples of things in nature that don't work very well as evidence that divine design can't be the case, because otherwise it would have been designed better. And what's really interesting, there's this woman, Sylvia Berryman, who's done a lot of good research on mechanistic thinking in antiquity. She is really, really clear on this, and I think this is absolutely right. Epicureans are not mechanists. They don't think about things as if they're machines, in large part because machines have designers, machines have purposes. The nature for Epicureans does not have design or purpose. The gods are off doing their own thing. They're not concerned with designing the world. If they were, the world would be, again, if gods were to care about the world, it wouldn't have all these imperfections. It wouldn't be falling apart like it is for the Epicureans. So the fact is, for the Epicureans, they're not invoking craft analogies. They're not thinking about the world as a machine. They're not thinking about the world as operating on machine logic like you get in the early modern period. If anything, they're attributing all the different variation among the world to chance, to spontaneity, to contingency. And I think that's a really fundamental point that people really need to sort of take seriously, is that determinism and materialism in the ancient world, those two things are not just unrelated, they're kind of incompatible. That to be a materialist, this is, again, the swerve in Epicureanism. It's something that a lot of people sort of find kind of bad. But in my mind, I think on this point, it's entirely obvious why they posit a swerve, this sort of uncaused chance thing. Well, you don't have determinism, so why should we even presume that everything follows regular predictable laws? Determinism works when something is externally imposing an order on nature. That's fine for Plato, Aristotle, Stoics. Yeah, you have God imposing order on nature. Epicureans say, no, the gods don't do that. Nature is self-governing. The natural order of things does not have any divine intervention, not in the sense that God's tinkering with it and fixing it. It's that God doesn't rule over it at all. That's just not what gods do. And I think that's a really fundamentally important point that we should take seriously if we're interested in modern materialism. Should we even consider materialism and determinism to be related? I think if we're thinking from a perspective of ancient philosophy, we probably shouldn't. And to sort of go back to something I said earlier, I think this is actually why Meillassoux is such a good materialist. Because he actually separates those two things. And in my mind, kind of in that sense, is a really loyal Epicurean in a way that's actually really good and really important. But again, conversation for another time. But again, it's an important thing that, again, we take for granted. So much of our thinking about materialism is still rooted in early modern conceptions of things, where determinism is thought through this machine kind of picture machine analogy. And, to be materialist means having immutable laws of nature. Again, to me, that sounds weird, because who's writing these laws? Where do you get laws from if there's not a lawgiver? It makes perfect sense if you're in a theistic mindset like Descartes. Descartes' writing the Meditations to argue for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. If you're taking on his ontology, you're going to actually, in my mind, be committed to those things too. So, really bracketing our assumptions about what we assume materialism and determinism and things like that, what these things might not actually entail each other. In fact, they may actually go in part. That's sort of a thing I'm certainly happy to flesh out more as well. But again, I think it's an important thing to be keeping in mind.
This is actually really important for a couple of different things. I think one, when I argue with a lot of analytic philosophers who argue like so generously about determinism and indeterminism, and I will agree with them that you don't get libertarian free will in a swervy universe. But if the ultimate grounds of being, causation is a lot more random, and there are no, and maybe there aren't really. Maybe laws are more interactively emergent than 19th century physicalists want to admit. Then a lot of the way we talk about determinism and naturalism as if they automatically flow from each other divorces. And I actually think it's interesting that this has already happened several times. I mean, it's already happened several times in several different cultural traditions.
Yeah.
Now we've been talking about ancient Greek. I can bring this up in the context of Dharmic philosophy, where this division not only occurred between proto-Hindus and Buddhists and Jains. We got to include the Jains in there. But also, if we really study it, we'll see it occurred within those traditions when they separated again. You can talk one of the weirder debates that is a weird philosophical debate that most non-Buddhists don't understand is the debates over whether or not Buddha nature has substance or not.
Yeah.
And people go, what does that mean? I'm like, it has both metaphysical, ethical, and, believe it or not, physical implications. If you understand the world this way. And it was highly worked out. And so when I started noticing in the ancient Greeks, I'm like, okay, we're confusing something.
Yeah.
Because most people who talk about determinism versus indeterminism, you know, and I've said before, I'm a compatibilist, and they were like, oh, you're really a libertarian. I'm like, no, I don't really think you have counter-causal free will. Not because I don't think you have control over your agency. I'm not sure what you is, and I'm not sure, believe it or not, and I'm not sure what counter-causal would be, but if there are multiple options, and those options are substantive, even if they're limited by other constraints, they are real. So that makes me a compatibilist, I guess. But to get this away from minds, because the modern way of thinking about this is minds, and I will say most of the time, I forget the philosopher who says this a lot, but that most questions after Heidegger that we call ontology should actually be called epistemology or psychology.
Yeah.
Because they're not really about ontology. And in fact, one of the things in critical theory is I want to ban people from using the word ontology unless they can tell me what being is. Like by what they mean by being, or becoming, or nothing. Which at least that means the German idealists can stay, but everybody else, get the fuck out. You don't know what the word means. Then people go, but words change. I'm like, okay, right, you got me.
Yeah. Well, just to sort of briefly interject here on a relevant point on this is that, you know, coming at this from a bit more of an ancient perspective, and being in a graduate program that is, again, pretty historical, has a lot of continental people in it. You know, every time I sort of talk about the nature of things, which in my mind is kind of, in some ways, what the kind of core of philosophy is talking about the nature of things. You know, I start asserting some kind of reality about the world. The first response is usually, well, how do you know this? How do you know this? So it's almost like the shift to modernity or even post-modernity, you can't actually talk about how things are. You just talk about how you know that things are what they are. And it's usually the kind of punt is the shift from ontological assumptions to epistemological, which I think is fine. I understand why that happens. But at a certain point, we have to actually talk about metaphysics. You can't get around it. That's sort of been the eternal thing that people have always been trying to find a way out of metaphysics. But in doing so, you just end up having very impoverished ontologies. Sorry,
logical positivists.
But they recognize this themselves. Yeah.
No. One of my I always say this stuff about logical positivists, but I want to be very clear on this. The logical positivists defeated themselves. You didn't beat them.
Yeah.
Like the disproof of logical positivism came from a logical positivist. It is not like, I mean, I know some people try to resurrect it, but like, seriously, the criterion of positive science was undone by them, not by an outside movement. And actually, that's kind of rare that, you know, a group is that self-honest. So I'm not actually slagging the logical positivists the way most like English grad students who learn about how the logical positivists were wrong do. I say this as a person who learned philosophy and then became an English grad student. But I want to get back to this. We were talking about Plato,
right,
and like the assumptions of Plato. We talk about Socrates. I think is actually quite interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things I think we miss is I also think since we understand Greek religion mostly through mythology, and we understand most modern religion through dogmatics, ontology and metaphysics, and then the psychologies emerge from that. I do think we miss some of the ways in which Socrates may have been, and Plato may have been more in line with certain elements of religious thought at the time than it initially seems. Even though sometimes they seem almost like monotheist, sometimes I mean, it's very hard. They don't talk in this mythic way, except when they do, because Plato's always talking, I mean, even more than Socrates, always talking in mythic ways. And yet, we don't often recognize them as myths. I mean, the biggest example of this is the fucking Atlantis story, because like that's clearly both probably an esoteric story and also an ideological myth, and people read it literally. That was fun. Thank you, 19th century. Good job.
Yeah. On this point about Atlantis, I think, it's very clearly invented. No one else talks about this. It's just Plato. So he is clearly invoking it not as a historical event, but as a sort of teaching point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is actually a point that can actually help us really get into the Greek mindset, how they sort of see themselves in the world. And that's actually, I think, very interesting. The Greeks are very, especially at the time of Plato, more than ever, very aware of how they are like extremely historically illiterate compared to the seemingly eternal civilization of Egypt. Egypt stretches back in their mind basically forever. There are records run out at some point, but the Greeks have no real expectation that the Egyptians are ever going to stop existing. So the Egyptians geographically are kind of like, in their relationship to the Greeks, are kind of like the relationship between the gods and the human beings. And this actually is very interesting. While the Greeks are subject to these periodic cycles of being wiped out by natural disasters and having to reconstitute themselves, in the same way that human souls forget divine wisdom and have to relearn it, the gods, or the Egyptians, are spared from this and have a basically unbroken access to eternal truths. So the Atlantis story really is a kind of grappling with, on a personal level, the forgetting that the soul undergoes and the needing to recall what it once knew, on the personal, social, and kind of metaphysical level, and the cycles of conflagration that the Greeks are subjected to. They get it from the Egyptians because the Egyptians are sort of separated off. They are an eternal civilization that has access to these eternal truths. And that's why, in some ways, for the Greeks, their philosophy begins as this wisdom tradition with the Egyptians, because the Greeks are constantly forgetting and having to relearn. Aristotle's like, oh my God, we finally relearned the four causes. But in his mind, the Egyptians are kind of actually the original source of this. And the Atlantis myth, you can't really disentangle from that. It's a story of the Greek awareness of forgetting and relearning that other civilizations, in virtue of being separate off from that kind of geographical issue, aren't subjected to. And so obviously it makes no sense to read it literally. It's put there at the very beginning of the Timaeus because you're then about to start talking about cosmology. You're then about to start talking about the order of the universe. And so you understand the soul's place in it first. The Timaeus basically begins with a recap of Plato's Republic. The last thing in Plato's Republic is the myth of this grand trip through the cosmos, this sort of near-death experience where the whole universe is sort of laid out in this divinely ordained order. And so then you need to understand why the soul forgets that. It ends with, again, this story of a soul's vision to the afterlife and the forgetfulness that souls are subjected to. And then you get this analogy, this sort of similar story at the beginning of the Timaeus to remind you, hey, here's where we left off. We're resuming right there again.
Mm-hmm. One of the more interesting things that I was thinking about when we talk about like Marxist views of materialism, because there's a great debate between like Hegelian Marxist materialism, although that is in and of itself is ironic because Hegel was not a materialist. And not only do I think we need to take ancient philosophy at face value and actually let its weirdness be as weird as it seems, I also think we need to take early modern philosophy at face value and quit trying to say like Hobbes was secretly an atheist, Descartes was secretly an atheist, Hegel was secretly an atheist. No, the fuck they weren't. Their philosophy makes no sense. Actually, if you do that, you are picking and choosing to make things work. Now, are there notions of God incommensurate with like Orthodox Catholic Christianity or Orthodox Protestant Christianity or Lutheranism. I mean, Hegel thought it was, but no, I mean, absolutely not. But the idea that you can just say, oh, when he's talking about religion and God, because it's negativity, he doesn't actually mean it. What are you on? Marx thought he meant it, for sure. But this also leads us to problem Marx. And this is a problem that we get into a great debate, because some people will say Marx is an Epicurean materialist. And I think, in the sense that he thinks of materialism as a form and an emergent quality, that is loosely kind of true. It is, he is not like a, say, clockworkist Englishman who thinks the universe is a clockwork, and that was because God made it that way. And then, like, we don't believe in God anymore, but we still believe in the clock God built. Which even Richard Dawkins, who's not a person I would normally cite as a philosophical authority in anything, realizes is a problem for, picking up an early materialist thinking in like Victorian and Edwardian times versus, slightly later on, because evolution supposedly changes everything. Although the point I am making is, no, it already kind of was assumed that way in Epicurean thought in some way. It's just that they weren't atheists like you were. You still had to have, they just assumed God. I mean, like, there's no evidence that they didn't assume that gods were real. Just like there's no evidence that the early Buddhists didn't assume that the gods were real. They just didn't matter. Which I guess blames me to, though, taking Marx, with problems with taking Marx as an Epicurean of any sort, or an Aristotelian, which is also something is important. I do think you have to know Aristotle to get some of what Marx is up to, but I don't think you can read him as an Aristotelian, and that's kind of because he does have certain Aristotelian assumptions about teleology that an Epicurean would never have.
Yeah.
But they are not Aristotle's or Aquinas' assumptions about teleology. They are kind of the assumption that there must be a teleology for the historical dialectic to work. And what is a teleology? Well, the teleology is negative, but and what is the most negative virtue would be freedom, blah, 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 blah. There are a lot of, and I know Marx is like, well, this is not philosophy, this is science. And I'm like, it's not science. I'm sorry. Like, I mean, not in the way we mean the word now, anyway. I know I could also do that 70s thing where you say, well, but Marx meant Wissenschaft, which can kind of mean science, but can also mean logic. And I'm like, yeah, but it's that doesn't get you away from the problem as much as I think it does. I find it interesting that the anti-Hegelian people also actually end up being more like true Epicureans. And my example of that is Althusser.
Yeah.
Althusser from Spinoza's aleatoric materialism is basically a return to the Lucretian swerve.
Yeah, no, it's very clear. It's very clear by the end of it. Yeah.
And why does he do that? Well, he gets into a determinism problem.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to bracket out all the, he relaxed to. Althusser, we do actually have indications of his psychology, so I can psychologize him fairly. He responds to his earlier kind of science of logic Hegelian self, realizes that there's a problem with some of these notions of consciousness and alienation. Now, I actually think alienation's more scientific of a concept than Althusser does, but I get why he thinks that in the context of the early 20th century and mid 20th century thought. He's also, his model for science is structural linguistics. And I guess Lacanian psychology, which that's a weird model for science. But
don't tell Zizek that.
Yeah. Shh. Does Zizek even pretend to be scientific though? Like,
honestly, probably not. But that's a conversation for another time. But
not that he's as relevant as he once was, but I used to listen to Zizek Captivated when I was in my 20s, and then I just thought about, like, wait, he can't mean everything he's saying and it make any sense. He like, unless he doesn't care about the law of non-contradiction. in statements, not like I know dialecticians.
Yeah. I remember attending a Zizek talk. It was actually quite interesting. I know it's online somewhere, where it was him, Alenka Zupancic, and Mladen Dolar. And Zizek related an anecdote about probably the greatest compliment, but also simultaneously most damning insult that Mladen Dolar made about Zizek, which is that he's been writing the same book for his entire career, just in various different sort of facets and manifestations, but it's just the same shtick. And Zizek was like, "You got me. It's completely right." And so you'd think that if it's the same book, you'd be a little bit more consistent. But that's, again, I don't want to speak too ill on Zizek. I'm actually rather favorable toward Zizek, even though I think he gets a lot wrong. I still have a soft spot for the sniffly Sauvignon, but
he was my gateway drug. Him and Badu were my gateway drugs out of the milieu post-structuralism and our reactionary analytical thought. Not that all, I'm going to be clear, not that all analytical thought was reactionary. The part that I was in was reactionary.
Yeah, I mean, I can say the same. Yeah, on my end as well. So I have to give credit where credit's due. Again, I think they're especially the kind of the dead end of, especially very lit-critized, postmodernism in the academy, where it's just this sort of spinning your wheels forever. Zizek and Badiou, great gateway drugs out of that for sure. But let's sort of bring it to Marx. I think there's so much that could be said about tracing Marx's sort of ancient and even medieval influences. I wouldn't say it's a great book, but it's an interesting book. This guy, Cyril Smith, reformed Trotskyist, wrote this book, Karl Marx and the Future of the Human, where, despite the title, a huge chunk of it's basically focused on looking at the kind of Neoplatonic and Western esoteric underground current in Marx. And I was often kind of unsure if this connection really held any water. But as I got more into Plotinus, I actually do think there's a really interesting point where both Marx and Plotinus actually have a very similar notion of something we call self-creation. And this is what Smith does talk about. I don't think he articulates it super well, but again, I think it's onto something there. So this will sound familiar to people who've read Marx, but probably less familiar for people who kind of think about Plotinus. But Plotinus has this way of thinking about creation or self-actualization. Again, these going to be a bit vague initially, but hopefully it'll become clear as I describe it, where you have this thing that's known as the principle of two acts. For something to be what it is, its first activity is its own self-constitutive unity. Mm-hmm. So being what it is its first activity. And its second activity is manifesting an image of itself exterior to itself in a way that doesn't directly affect that thing. Super vague sounding. If you're not super into philosophy, you're like, what is this dude saying? Here's an analogy way of thinking about it. Plotinus often appeals to like the sun. So the sun, in being the sun, is just sort of doing its own thing. As a result of it being its own thing, being the sun, it's generating all this heat and light and energy. All right. So, okay. The specific analogy of the sun, that's where you want me to resume? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, understanding these complex ideas, always good to use analogies. I think this is something you see a lot in ancient philosophy for a reason. I'll give a couple. I'll start with one that I think is perhaps kind of intuitive. Plotinus, for example, thinks about this in terms of the sun. The sun, in being the sun, boiling heat, plasma, energy, what have you, that is the first activity. It just sort of does that all on its own. The second activity of the sun is the generation of light and heat that emanates out from that. And that is, as people like Bataille and others pick up on, that is then responsible for the whole of human civilization, of life, all the stuff we get on Earth. But the first and kind of primary activity of the sun is not concerned with any of its effects. It's just being the sun. And in virtue of being the sun, it then produces an aspect of itself outside of itself. And so Plotinus sees this as basically how you get the whole metaphysical system in his mind. It's a really core principle of all cause and effect, not just in time, but in logic and things like that. So in the human version of this, we, in virtue of being humans, sort of have to, our primary act is our organic self-constitution, basically sort of being a unified organism. For Plotinus, health and unity are basically kind of one and the same kind of thing. The more healthy you are, the more unified your body is, etc. But we create an image of ourselves, something like ourselves, in the artifacts that we make and the technologies that we produce. And so Marx, I think, consciously or not, is picking up on an idea or an aspect of this in his theory of alienation and the early writings on species being, in a way that is actually, I think, probably responding to Rousseau more than anyone else. But Rousseau is super Epicurean on this point. Not to get too far afield on like Epicurean anthropology, but for readers of Rousseau, you'll probably recognize this from the second discourse. Both the Epicureans and then Rousseau think that technology emerges because of natural scarcity, but that is not a natural state of affairs for human beings. It's a thing that's done out of necessity because we need to do it, not because we want to do it. And so there's a sense in which, for someone like Rousseau, when we use technology, we're sort of alienating ourselves inherently because we're taking a part of ourselves and putting it in something outside of ourselves. That disunifies the human person. I think Marx can't ever fully say no to that, but he wants to have a positive upshot for it. He wants to have a sense in which there is a form of human self-actualization that is generative, that produces something external to itself, that doesn't come at the diminution of our essence. So alienated production for someone like Marx is going to be that Rousseauian sense, where you're taking something in yourself and putting it outside of yourself. But in the same way that the sun, when it is the sun, isn't doing that for the sake of the world on Earth. It's not doing that because it really wants there to be all these plants and animals thriving on Earth. It doesn't know or care about the thing that goes on Earth. It's just being itself. There's a similar sort of way in which human technical activity, again, in the positive sense for Plotinus, is generative, puts something outside of itself that doesn't come at any sort of cost or diminution to what you yourself are, but rather is the expression of what you yourself are. I think Marx understands non-alienated production as being like that. It's not you removing something from your essence and putting it outside of yourself, that's alienated production, but this more Neoplatonic notion of self-creation, where you are, in virtue of completing and unifying yourself, producing an image of that outside of yourself. In fact, I think Marx goes a little bit more Hegelian and says, that's how you reach the completion, is in that sort of externalizing activity. So even these things that sound very abstract metaphysical, I think are still rooted in some of these very ancient ways of understanding the nature of the subject, causation, things like that. And so tracing these sorts of lines historically, you need to know where Marx is getting these things, where he's getting these ideas from. Yes, he's very Epicurean in that, unlike all these other schools, he thinks that nature has no governor. There's no thing outside of nature that's ruling over nature. Nature is self-constituting. Nature is self-ruling. But this is something you can see in like people like Paracelsus or sort of dissident Protestant philosophers in the early modern period too. And there's a reason why Marx and Engels have a somewhat positive appraisal of some of these people. Again, it's complicated. There's many threads, but the particular way in which Marx wants to see his way out of certain problems posed by this kind of Rousseauian Epicureanism, again, you need to understand the way in which he's getting it from these other strands as well. So kind of lost the train of thought a little bit, I think, with some of the interruptions, but I think that does kind of resume pretty neatly of where we were initially thinking.
Yeah, what this clarifies to me is a couple of different things. One, we are getting an Epicureanism read through a bunch of different thinkers, which inadvertently or deliberately incorporates other forms of thinking that do not come from that tradition, both modern and ancient.
Yeah.
I remember perusing Cyril Smith's book way back in the day. Okay, when it was new, around 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. Maybe it wasn't even new then. When it first came to Marxism. And the other, Cyril Smith was basically the only other person other than Leszek Kolakowski, a guy whose opinion of Marxism is very much colored by his reaction to the Soviet Union and his disillusionment with that. But it is interesting to me that he also sees Marx's origin in Plotinus, because he does. It's like where he starts the history of Marxism in the Kolakowski main current starts with Plotinus. And the Cyril Smith book got me thinking, okay, maybe this isn't as wackadoo as I initially thought it was. I mean, I thought it was just like, okay, so we locate German idealism in its ancient Neoplatonic, I guess, late Neoplatonic, middle. Where's Plotinus in the Neoplatonic?
Plotinus basically founds Neoplatonism. In his mind, he's not doing anything original, but that's true for most ancient philosophers. Like most ancient philosophers, most pre-modern philosophers think that innovation is the worst thing that you could be doing. You're deviating from the transmission of ancestral wisdom, basically. When Plotinus critiques the Gnostics, he's like, you're making up your own books and attributing them to people. That's not true. Or at least that's what Porphyry says. And he's like, you're deviating so much from Hellenistic philosophy by introducing these new foreign elements. That's the core of his critique. Then he sort of takes them to task on specific points. But again, in his mind, Plotinus isn't doing anything new, even when he is doing stuff that's new. Plotinus is 3rd century, so roughly the year 200 to 270 is where his life more or less goes. He is a very unique philosopher in a lot of ways. He's one of the few philosophers that we have everything that he's written, most likely. And unlike a lot of the later Neoplatonists, he's not just doing commentaries. He is kind of doing commentaries. He's certainly, commenting on Plato and Aristotle. But he really sets the curriculum for the next couple hundred years in the Neoplatonic school. And a lot of that basically sets the scope of the debate, and at least the picture of ancient philosophy that people have through the entire Middle Ages. And, again, things change, obviously, but the Neoplatonized reading of Aristotle is kind of the default mode of Jewish, Islamic, and Christian, both Western and Eastern philosophy, pretty much for the next 1,000 years.
Yeah, I was about to say, is the reason why we could trace like Marx to some reason back to Plotinus is because this is Hegel's reading this version of Aristotle, which comes to us through Christian and Islamic thought, particularly Aquinas, but not just to give the Catholics all the credit, also through Al-Kindi and all the Islamic philosophers. And they clearly, I mean, like they attribute stuff to Aristotle that's only attributed to Aristotle and Neoplatonists forward. And they also read Aristotle and Plato as totally copacetic, which is interesting. But once you know that, you do see this, like, okay, so not there's this like tradition of reception that weirdly the German philological project has actually managed to bury, even though a lot of these early readings are based on it, which is a very interesting problem. Because, by the time you get to Heidegger, you got people claiming they're getting back to the essence of these original texts, or you have what is being done in like the Victorian Academy Forward in English language philosophy, where they are stripping out anything weird from these texts to make them copacetic with a fairly modern, semi-materialist, soft Christian worldview.
You see this a lot with the way in which at this time people start reading proto-evolutionary ideas into both Aristotle and Epicureanism, despite the fact that neither of them really, by any remote stretch of the imagination, would have that. Sometimes it just is a kind of a blatant misreading of the text. But in the case of Epicureanism, at least it's a little bit more understandable why they would think it's something like evolution. But, sometimes it really just is wanting to see something that's there, in large part because they want it to be kind of prefigured in classical texts. But, you have no notion of evolution in any of these things.
Yeah. I've read a whole lot about atheism in the ancient world, for example, and I have concluded that there were a few, but a lot of people that both modern philosophers and modern skeptics and modern, modernist readings of this, they take a weird cue from Leo Strauss, actually, where they're like projecting a secret esoteric reading onto these people. Oh, they would be suppressed by the church. Okay, sure.
What church in ancient Greece?
Yeah. Or even when you deal with early moderns, like, oh, well, Descartes didn't really believe that because he was secretly an atheist because he would have been suppressed by the church. And I'm like, okay, prove it though. Like,
yeah. If anything, what's more likely and more fair to say is that the kind of dissident religious trend that's breaking with the church is like weird mystical pantheisms.
Yes.
And
like Spinoza.
Yeah, exactly.
Also not an atheist.
Yeah. And I actually, again, name that probably I shouldn't be mentioning, but I do think at least picks up on this correctly. Peter Lamborn Wilson, I think, is not going to mince words on this. Like, historically, when he's like sort of looking at these sorts of things, he's like, oh, no, spiritual anarchism needs to be a kind of weird mystical pantheism. It's not atheism. It's just weird mystical pantheism. That doesn't touch on anything else that he says. But again, I think he at least is right to pick up that's the dissident trend. It's not prefiguring modern atheism in any stretch of the imagination.
No. And I think it's, for example, when Spinoza, I'm like, yeah, Spinoza really thought he was an atheist after he got excommunicated from his community. There's no reason why, at least in his private notes, he couldn't have admitted it. Like, at that point, the Christians might get him, sure, but like in his private note, but we have no evidence. We have absolutely no evidence. And it's not like we've lost a lot of Spinoza's writing that I know of.
Yeah. I mean, even in a lot of his letters, like he's referring to medieval proofs for the God's existence by Crescus and others, and clearly reading like Crescus, Gersonides, these like Jewish medieval philosophers. He's like, oh, well, they got their arguments for God's existence wrong. Here's a better argument. Right. That's not an atheist. That's by no stretch of the imagination an atheist.
Now, it's also not like a folk theist that you'll meet at an evangelical church.
Yeah.
But that's not most medieval thinkers.
Very few. Yeah.
And I know after reading Carlo Ginzburg, we also don't really understand what everyday people thought too, and it's often way weirder and more elaborate than you think.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to, you made this point about this. I was going to ask you, what do you make of this? Because materialism does, I want to bring to bear the problem that you get in Marxism because it's materialism based. And I'm not just talking about monism and monism and imperial criticism, the terrible Lenin book. It's the Lenin book I don't like. Where like he has a dialectic of mind and then I'm like, but what is mind for you though? Since you don't mind is another substance. But anyway, just to get this back on track. There's a great debate within Marxism about how rigid his determinism is. And his own rhetoric is actually wild. I mean, like I've read almost every single thing I can get in Marx in English. I've read a lot of it in German. Haven't played around in the archives of the Mega Tour or anything, so I'm not that cool. But like, although most of the people who do that just seem to say the same thing the New Left does, and they don't really produce it anyway. That's a side complaint where I'm like, oh, you're supposed to get this whole new revelation, and I haven't seen it yet. But anyway, the thing that I want to focus in on here though is like this strange conception of materialism in Marx, which seems to have some properties of what we might call later on emergence or systems thinking, but isn't that, because it's not grounded in that philosophy. And I think, like I have said in the past, and I meant it, that it's pointing towards that, but it is not that.
Yeah.
And this leads to a couple of things. Whether or not you think he meant socialism was inevitable literally or not, whether or not he thought that socialism would automatically emerge from the working class even if socialists didn't exist, and these questions he hedges his bets on in his letters and stuff. Actually, like, that's clear. Like, because sometimes it's socialism inevitable, sometimes it's socialism in common ruin. And I'm like, those are different things. He also has a human-centric view of teleology, where he does see humans as somehow uniquely special. He places his specialness in labor, which is what I find kind of weird. There are some like anthropological truths into like human cooperation and building and social reproduction is kind of our advantage. We can't even beat most of our primate relatives in anything important, other than the fact that we can cooperate. We don't eat each other's babies automatically for lipids, and even if they're not directly related to us generally. And because of that, we can outcompete and seem to have enough generational skills to, like, build complex tools. All right. Just, so there's some anthropological truth to Marx's talk about labor. I don't want to completely discount it, but he really believes this is a uniquely human trait. And I'm like, well, the other primates do this. I don't know. like they have tools, like, and thumbs. And so I was like thinking about this problem in terms of Marxist materialism, because it poses a bigger problem in the 20th century. I mean, that's the alienation thing, the Rousseauian alienation, which I don't think is as unscientific an idea as the Althusserians do, but there's a whole lot the Althusserians are responding to more than just that.
Yeah, absolutely.
About how to justify, structures, because they want to get out of like very humanistic, very voluntaristic conceptions of history. And in Marx, there's something about the implications of his materialism that seem to almost have it both ways. Men create their history, but they're not of their own, blah, 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 blah. And I actually think there's some like truth to that, to be completely honest with you. There's the like contingency and necessity to get back to Miso are not really all that separate.
Yeah.
But what you can't do is say that he is then an Epicurean in the way the Epicureans were, because contingency and necessity, I mean, they would just say, well, stuff emerges because stuff happens. And that is kind of like where Althusser gets. And the problem that has for Althusser's politics is the aleatory materialism does just make it sound like, well, the swerve that creates the space to act is random. So basically, okay, well then why do you fight for revolution? And you actually are going to have a problem answering that. I think he does. I really do think Althusser does have a problem answering that in specific. It leads to a kind of ideological despair towards the end of his life. We also see this with Lukács completely separately from the Hegelian standpoint. They end up in the same kind of pit, partly because of political things and material history. Completely true. There's, you know, what happened in the Soviet Union bummed them out. The Sino-Soviet split really complicated Althusser's life. You know, all the shenanigans in the French Communist Party, you just list them forever. But there also does seem to be, in a very real sense, a philosophical problem here that comes from this kind of weird materialism that Marx didn't completely work out. And I do think it's incomplete. I mean, like, and that's me being charitable and not just saying it's incoherent. Yeah. And I think that's partly because there is this formalism that's coming from the Epicureans, but it's read through so many different things, and it's not, it's the, you know, the Epicurean formalism, I mean, the Epicurean formal materialism and the atomism and all that is actually a remarkably coherent worldview, actually. I mean, like, it really is. Like random stuff happens because random stuff happens, because everything is, you know, the basis of everything is passive matter. Its interactions create activity, and that's where most things come from. Maybe even gods. Have a nice day, and that's it. And like, just be happy with what happens with you, and carve out your little space in that, because you're not going to be able to shape it. Which is also why Epicureans reject politics.
Yeah,
like
100%.
It is a remarkably coherent worldview, as is the Stoic worldview, which was opposed to it. Like, but this kind of Epicureanism in Marx, you know, he's reading it through Rousseau, and he's reading it through, like, well, the Epicureans are materialists, but he's reading that through like a very, you know, post-Enlightenment lens. And he's trying to reconcile that with like Hegelian dialectical determinism, and then also liberal Whiggish determinism, of which Marx is not. I think calling Marx Whiggish is actually wrong, but like he's still pulling from that tradition in some ways. And I guess I should define that for new listeners. Whiggish is when you believe that progress continually gets better, because you know what better and progress is, and continually, and linearity somehow works. And so you have this thing, but if you don't, this kind of vagueness, but if you don't accept a teleological reading of Marxist materialism, then a whole lot of Marxist arguments don't work. You know, because one of the things that you have to understand, I think, from the standpoint of what Marx is trying to do in response to German idealism, is German idealism is about the is-alt problem's a big problem, because we realize that a lot of the ises are still described in oughts, because we still have to like use normative language to speak about anything, right? The German idealists kind of, they don't directly say that. This is me reading it in modern terms, and maybe you would reject me doing that, but they kind of see the problem, but their way of fixing it, I don't think works, to be quite frank with you. And then what Marx does is, like, he's a materialist, and he's not religious. He's definitely, you know, pushing past this left Hegelian reading of history into something that he would deem more scientific. But he doesn't seem to completely reconcile this like hangover from the old way of being, because if he's truly got an Epicurean physics and an Epicurean metaphysics, his politics don't make a lot of sense, right? Like, yes, the Epicureans are communalists, yeah, true, but they're also completely apolitical. They think that you should basically leave, you know, the life of the polis to itself, go live out in a garden and stay away from everybody who's not just living out with you in the garden and not having a lot of stuff and eating cheese and fruit or whatever. Like, that's what they really believed. And so it's just weird. It does seem like this kind of plagues Marxism. And I say this because it shows up all over the place. This claim about materialism and ontology is also why Marx claims to not need an ethical basis for what he's arguing. But Marx clearly makes ethical appeals all over the place, even though he's denying he's doing it. There's no way around that acknowledgement. Like, he's saying he doesn't do it, but then, like, even in his scientific work, there's ethical. You don't call the bourgeoisie vampires if you don't have an ethical framework. But again, that tension is partly from a physical material tension in his own thought. And I wanted to like ask you that because you and I talked off air, and we were talking about the Chris Catrone, Benjamin Studebaker debates, and I was like sympathetic with Studebaker methodologically. That like I don't think Catrone is really taking the ancient world that seriously in his statements, but that ultimately I think Catrone's actually somewhat right that we can't really say that Marx is an Epicurean or that the ancient philosophy is really super informing what he's doing, even if Marx thinks it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of threads to pick up on. Probably many that I'll have to sort of leave there. And I'm not going to pretend I'm a Marxologist, even though I've been certainly interested in this and thinking about it for a while. I think in part because sort of similar to some things that you mentioned with the people who are in the mega and working through all the archival material, I feel like every time I sort of say something about Marx, it immediately just raises up the red flags of people who sort of work on this. And so I kind of want to defer to that. But at times I'm saying things I think kind of obviously have to be true, but people will contest vehemently anyway.
Well, they'll like find a scrap note from something he said once off the back of a sheet of paper and then use that to justify an old argument from the 1960s.
Yeah.
I'm being a jerk, but that is my experience of a lot of like the mega stuff. And sometimes I'm like, are you actually interested in going through the archives for us to understand Marx? Or are you interested in going through the archives so you can find a scrap of paper to turn Marx into a ventriloquist dummy?
Well, welcome to philosophy.
Well, I mean, like ancient philosophy, that's all we do. It's like, let's just everyone's got their hand up an image of Plato and just make it talk. Like,
I mean, I think you gotta in some ways you gotta know when you're doing here's me reconstructing, here's me being creative. You can do both, but those are different things. And you gotta know really clearly what you're saying that's sort of grounded in that, and what you're saying that's just, hey, look, isn't it crazy how he has the exact same opinions that I do on this? And always good to keep those two separate. I'm never going to pretend that I agree with Plotinus on most things. But again, it's good to know what you think that he sort of is generative for. So here's one example of the Marx thing that I think always was sort of baffling to me. I feel like you get this reading of the base superstructure relation. First off, I'm not even convinced that Marx has a super rigorous fleshed out theory of base superstructure. I don't think he even necessarily has this as what do you say?
I said he doesn't. Next question.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's a metaphor that comes up a few times, and like the even in Marx, everyone's like, oh, the base determines the superstructure. I'm like, actually, even Marx presents it as like almost a yin-yang feedback loop that where the base ultimately is more important, but then you have to deal with the fact relations of production, which determine all the superstructure, are part of the base. And that's what I mean by the yin yang part of it. It's not actually as clearly separate, and like economics determine everything. Particularly when you think about in modes of production, it's not clear in prior modes of production that politics and superstructure and economics are even separate for Marx. He seems to think that that's a feature of capitalism that it's unclear if Marx thinks is actually real too, if that's like an ideological feature of capitalism or a real trait of capitalism. And the reason why I say that is in capital, it seems to be like a ideological figure. But like if you read Marx's debates with the anarchists, then he seems to assert it as if it's real. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I largely reiterate everything you said, but I will sort of say also too, if Marx is a materialist, he has to have a sense in which the base is logically prior to the superstructure. Otherwise, it's not the base. It has to be some sort of material base that then produces these things that exist as a result of matter. So I will say, too, that again, it's not that the material base is immutable, unchanging, bound by deterministic laws, because clearly it is in a dynamic reciprocal relation with these other things as well. if you're a hunter-gatherer society and then suddenly start planting stuff to reuse year after year, you've transformed the material basis on which your society survives. So clearly, these things are going to have to affect each other. But again, hearing some of these like very critical theorized iterations on these sort of things in Marx, just to me end up sort of obfuscating so much where it's like, as you're saying, I don't really see a particularly rigorous theory of base and superstructure present in Marx's philosophy. Again, he's sort of invoking these sort of terms at times, I think mostly just to designate a logical relation in terms of certain kinds of what causes other things, but generally it's not like a particularly metaphysical account, at least as far as anything I can really glean from it. So one other thing I want to pick up on too is the point about sort of, is Marxism teleological? Is it deterministic? I think what's really tough and hard to say with some of these things is that we may be talking about very different notions of teleology and many different notions of determinism.
Bingo.
Yeah. And so one thing I'll sort of say just from the outset that is, I think, is always really important to keep in mind is that in the ancient Greek, I'll just say the ancient world in general, necessity and freedom are not seen as opposed. In fact, they're actually basically those two things go together. You're free because you act in accord with necessity. For moderns, it's no, it's the opposite. You're free because you can diverge from necessity. But, that's a fundamentally different way of sort of thinking about freedom. A lot of this gets introduced when people start thinking about the will as a distinct like faculty. Very Christian kinds of problems. You see this in like Anselm and other kind of thinkers trying to think about the will as a distinct causal role. Much of our modern way of thinking about free will is based on this. So Plotinus, for example, he says the one is the most free thing there is. Why? Not because it could have done something else or that it chose. No, the one didn't choose anything. Choice is between multiple options. That's unfree if you are choosing between multiple options because you're not perfectly unified. Rather, the one is free because nothing's making it do what it does. All its action stems from itself. Freedom is self-actualization, self-activity. That's what freedom consists in for most ancient philosophers. Not having something else determine your activity for you. But if it's perfectly deterministic in the sense of you couldn't have done anything otherwise, you have no counterfactual freedom, doesn't matter. That's sort of not really a consideration. That's really
it's irrelevant and stupid and dumb. No, I mean, for the ancient, it kind of is. I mean, like, and even for the Christian, you get to this on like free will. This is actually a theological debate within Christianity 100%. And in Islam. 100%, and it's very important. It's a very important one in Islam. But what that's about is actually not about materialism. It's about what you think concordance with God is. And so the way people talk about this after the 19th century and what I like to think of the secularization of Christian thought and early modern thinking.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily mean that they were secular. I mean that they started trying to explain Christian thought in secular ways. This really confuses things, I think, when it comes to because that's when you have to God's law, and if you logically extrapolate from God's law, and you also believe in either predestination or at least what is it, double wretchedness or whatever the shit, whatever Luther was on about, you end up having to two things prompting you to think in a way where okay, we have a mechanistic law of the universe because we have laws come from God, etc., etc., etc. Now, to be fair, I've been mean to Marxism. I also think modern liberalism is utterly incoherent about this shit because
probably worse ways too, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, way more worse.
Yeah.
Human rights. I when I say this, people liberals will say I am a radical conservative, but I'm like, human rights actually do not make sense when you no longer believe in divine origins of a natural law, because it's obvious they're alienatable because we alienate them all the damn time. And there's which is also why in liberal human rights thinking, you can basically call any fucking thing a right. And I know people get really uncomfortable when I say stuff like, if you are a consistent person who does not believe in either social contract theory or natural law, and natural law does not require you to be Christian, but it does at least require you to believe that there's God. Your assertions of rights are basically Big Rock Candy Mountain shit wish list. And oh my God, do people get mad at me for that? Like, you sound like a radical, because conservatives argue this all the time. Well, the conservatives aren't wrong. I mean, they're probably wrong that there's a singular divine creator that, in a sense, is natural law, and I'm not even sure the concept of natural law actually makes any goddamn sense. But human rights as something other than just tacit political agreements that transcend national boundaries really are based on that way of thinking, and you don't believe in the basis anymore, or you can't argue that basis can be the primary basis if you're also secular, even if you do believe in that basis. So you can't argue that, like, well, clearly there's the whole world believes in some kind of divinity, which is a lawgiver. No, they don't. Like, you could think that. I mean, it's a stretch even in the early modern period, but you could probably convince yourself of that somewhat rationally off of your existing evidence and misinterpretations of religions. But once you have any knowledge of stuff like the Dharmic traditions and certain shamanistic ways of thinking, and the borderlines between anthropology and religious studies, et cetera, you just have to throw that out the window. Like, it's just like, nope, gone. There's not everybody has a lawgiver. Just like that is not a human universal.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. So when I say this about Marx, I'm still a Marxist. I just think we have to admit that Big Daddy Marx didn't work all this shit out. I mean, the other place where I think it's like, I believe in modes of production, but Marx's work on modes of production is essentially like a list that Engels made, that he cribbed from some bourgeois economists that he doesn't even totally believe in. And there's a here be dragons for like pretty much everything in the ancient world as far as how the modes of production actually work.
Yeah.
And oh my God, if it's in Asia, we're just like Asiatic despotism because Hegel said so. Bye. Like, it's this weird mixture. I mean, the list of modes he gives us is this weird mixture of Whiggish British thought hybridized with Hegel's story and the phenomenology and in the lectures of the history of religion. And I'm not even sure Marx really believes in it that deeply. Like, for example, like, does he actually believe that there is a coherent slave mode of production in the antique world? Yeah, kind of, actually he does. But if he had known more about the antique world, would he have thought that was the primary driving thing? Because it only is sometimes. Like, it is in the Roman and Greek classical world, but it's not everywhere. And I think, we live in this weird heyday where, like, everyone's trying to come up with new modes. My favorite is Samir Amin, and this is off of your specialization. But like, he comes up with like everything is tributary mode of production except for European capitalism, basically. And even that's going to become tributary mode of production because of decadence. And I'm just like, well, that doesn't really explain anything, dude.
Yeah. You see the same impulse with the whole techno-feudalism discourse.
Oh my God, that is so... It's a bad reading of everything. Like, yeah. I was watching Yanis Varoufakis talk about Palantir entering the war in Iran, which is, by the way, we're recording 3 days after that started.
Yeah.
That's what I'm distracting myself from right now.
Right.
It's a proof of techno-neo-feudalism. And I'm like, what do you think what the internet was used for during the global war on terror? In fact, who invented the And why? It was the fucking military. And they gave it to private sector corporate, and that was also why we couldn't get the Soviets to release their computers and their cybernetic systems, because they kept it as a military secret.
Like, only if we had a trinary computing device, that would be the solution to all this.
Oh my god, it's but so I'm like techno neo, and I'm also like, okay, in feudalism, rents also are tied to food. What's producing the food and the energy in your techno-neo-feudal matrix, my friend? It's not robots. But anyway, and I'm like, this is like a reductive analysis that's based off of rhetoric. And you know, like, to defend Marx, he didn't do that much. Like, and I think the biggest condemnation that you can make of Marx is just like, he's inconsistent because he's also a political thinker. He's actually not setting out to build a coherent system. He's setting out to build a coherent political economy, but that political economy does have implications for materialism, the study of history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like, I think this is important when you look at ancient philosophies, because it's not like Aristotle just had a random grab bag of shit he believed. Well, except about science. I think science is sometimes a random grab bag of shit.
Well, that's the best part about all the natural philosophy stuff. It's, here's all these principles, but there is this thing that does violate it, so we have to, you know, like, one of my favorite examples of that is in Aristotle's On Dreams, he relays this thing that no one else says, and he has no reason to mention, but he thinks that women while menstruating can stain mirrors red by staring at them long enough.
I do remember this, actually, and being completely baffled by
Everyone's baffled by it, because Aristotle is famous for having a theory of vision where stuff enters into our eyes, rather than what was the more common view that Plato and others talk about, where our eyes shoot out beams of light that then come back to us and give us sensory information, like a cane sticking out and poking things. Aristotle's like,
neither of those things
your
are
eyes
true,
don't shoot out beams of light, but menstruating women do turn mirrors red when they stare at them. This is what's fun about ancient philosophy, is you have to ask yourself, why on earth are these people committed to some of these things?
No, it is wild what some of these people, I mean, like, this is like, when people are like trying to convince me that Plato is like ultimately rational, and I'm like,
not by our standards.
Like, no, like, I assume his base worldview, yeah, I mean, yes, it is rational from that perspective, but like, yeah, my favorite is all the weird legends about someone we know very little actually about, which is Pythagoras.
Yeah,
I've been reading all kinds of histories on Pythagoras, and everyone's like, you know what? We don't actually know anything. But my favorite ones is like, he dies. I mean, we don't even know, because there's multiple stories of a death even, but he dies because he won't run through a field of beans, because beans are souls, or maybe they haven't soul because they look like embryos, maybe. I mean, and that's not even in the story. It's just like, you get the story. I remember reading Simon Critchley's book on the death of philosophers and getting the various legends of how Pythagoras dies. And I'm like, so he wouldn't run across the field of beans because he thought they might be ensouled because they might look like babies. But even you don't really know that. You're trying to make sense of the stories from what we do know, that he wouldn't eat beans. And that's weird. I am sort of like, man, if you're a vegetarian who doesn't eat beans in the ancient world, I don't know where you're getting your protein from. But maybe that explains a lot. But nonetheless, you just get these wild stories, and people just take them as one-offs. And I'm like, no, we're missing what connects us. Or maybe it is one of those weird things, like, no, he just really didn't think you should eat beans. I don't know, man. Like, and we don't know. But, you know, it's either we don't know, and you should say we don't know, or we should assume it's coherent, and then I got to figure out what it has to do with the music of the spheres and the transmigration of the soul and why he believed that and what the fuck that has to do with beings. Probably something, I mean, if I'm really being honest, it's probably something about the animating force of air and gas. And I'm not joking.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah,
we don't
yeah.
know that. I'm just wildly speculating
Yeah.
here. But I just know what people thought the animating force in the ancient world might be: wind, pneuma. And so, like, that's why that word means that. So, like,
yeah, you get that in Indian philosophy too. I'll give one example that I think is really, really fun from Plotinus. We know next to nothing about Plotinus's early life. We have actually very few biographical information about him, really, as far as like what his day-to-day life was. We know two really interesting things that Porphyry gives us about his life. One, Plotinus suffered from GI issues. Like he had like gut problems for his whole life. And the other thing,
go ahead.
The other thing is that the one detail of his childhood we know is that Plotinus was breastfed really, really late, up until maybe like early teens.
Oh wow, okay, that's really, really late. Okay, and we know
both
this.
very psychoanalytically interesting, and not, in my mind, not arbitrary things that Porphyry's including in his life of Plotinus. I'm not going to say
what I think they
matter, but they are interesting to sort of keep in mind.
Yeah, because why would Porphyry mention it if he doesn't give us any other details except these two weird ones? Like, yeah, and Plotinus is one of these people we almost are certain has existed. I know there's certain ancients and we're like, I don't know, but although I do remember for a while, I remember someone telling me there was a debate. This was like a community college professor, and he probably shouldn't have said this. There's a debate on the existence of Socrates, and I'm like, I doubt it, since there's like multiple sources.
Yeah.
And there's points in which they, as we mentioned with Xenophon and Plato, like I do the triangulation. Like, what does Xenophon say? What does Plato say? What did the people making fun of Socrates say? Because we have some of that too.
Yeah.
And then what do the Stoics and the Cyrenaic anecdotes say? Because they also tie back into Socrates, and it gives us these, because the Cyrenaics definitely don't agree with the Neoplatonists. But they all claim Socrates. So you got to like try to figure out how they all fit together at all. So it's wild. It's wild with the ancient world. I mean, and we have better grounds for the Greeks than we do for, like, I've mentioned direct philosophy. I've read a shit ton of Nagarjuna. I'm not sure he's real. I mean, like, there are people called Nagarjuna for sure, but like, is it even one person? Those writings don't read. I don't read enough of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit to know, but like, they don't read like the same person in translation. I'll tell you that. Like,
you get this all the time with Aristotle, and Plato to some degree, but especially Aristotle, where so much of the assumptions with, is this an authentic thing by Plato? Is this an authentic thing by Aristotle? There's some examples where it's pretty cut and dry, but there's some examples where it's like, oh, well, Plato or Aristotle wouldn't have written this because it doesn't agree with the rest of the things that we believe about Aristotle or Plato. And it's like, well, cart and horse are now fully intertwined in this case.
Can we talk about an example of that for both of them? I mean, my favorite was like trying to reconcile the Parmenides with everything else. Because I'm like, wait, did Plato just debunk his own theory of forms? What the fuck is going on here? Like,
yeah, I will say this. This is one of the things I will say in big favor of Neoplatonism. The Parmenides is an awfully hard dialogue, but the Neoplatonists make it a lot more coherent as far as fitting in within Plato's project. In no small part, too, because it seems like when you look at Plato's dialogues sort of spread out over the course of things, there are certain ways of talking about the forms that you're going to have to move beyond at a certain way. But in many ways, the Parmenides is one of the most important dialogues, especially for Neoplatonists, because it's where they think, one, they get all the kind of like crazy hypotheses from. They see it all in the Parmenides. They really just see it as a systematization of what's laid out in the Parmenides. And even like relatively weird arguments. Like at one point in the Parmenides, There's certain things that are being discussed. One is whether or not there's a form of hair and mud. This is actually a very important question for later Platonism. But then there's also this question of, are the forms, do they cover over things like a sail covering over multiple people laying down? Again, weird arguments in Plato, but you actually get really different diverging theories of how forms instantiate based on whether or not later Neoplatonists agree with the sail metaphor or not. And so they see the Parmenides as really being this kind of like thing that you give students who are, they've gotten the basics down. You know, they've read the dialogues that are being circulated to the general public, the stuff about like, you know, friendship and, you know, good conduct, those sorts of things. There's things that like, you know, the stupid normal people can handle. Once you've done your due diligence, you need to now be like vigorously disabused of many of your notions that you've developed of what the forms and sort of these metaphysics ultimately are. And so many of Neoplatonic debates are really about interpretation of the Parmenides, how we understand the principles that give rise to the forms. Because that's actually, I think, a thing that people really misunderstand, I think, about Plato, is that the forms are not really, not necessarily what Plato's main innovation is. You know, Plato's actually not the first one to talk about forms. You actually get it even as far back as Democritus. What's really interesting about Plato is that, again, he's actually trying to account for forms, but prior to that, principles. So you get to these later dialogues, things like the Sophist, where he's trying to figure out what the highest genera, the highest kinds. He's trying to think about principles, like fundamental principles, and trying to, in some ways, reduce that to a single first principle. I do think that's in Plato. I think the Neoplatonists are not introducing new things when they articulate one. But
I mean, it's also in Aristotle too.
Exactly.
That's legitimately in Aristotle. Like it's not like the Neoplatonic thinkers or the late Platonists or the middle Platonists put it there. Like, and this is what I mean about the, like, when I said forms and geometric logic, but geometric forms are also based off proofs, which are first axioms. And if you have this mind where like the most complete thing is the simplest self-organizing thing that is both necessary and self-sufficient, blah, 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 you know, you got to have an axiom emergent from that thing to justify everything else. There have been times where I get over reductive myself, and I've been like, well, this is why Western science is the way it is versus like whatever the hell was going on in ancient India, because you don't have a tendency to reduce things. In fact, what you have in, like, if you know the history of like Abhidharmic thought, which is their version of metaphysics, and its collapse, you have an attempt to get down to first principles after you remove the concept of a first principle. Then you just have like, well, there's a Dharma. What's a Dharma? I don't know. It's a form. And they're like, but how does a form have a form? Shit. And then you get, okay, well, you have emptiness. What is emptiness? Is it nothingness? No, it's untapped, unformed potentiality. There. All right. But that's not a first principle. That's actually back to like, it's almost Epicurean randomness from a completely different set of metaphysical and physical assumptions.
Yeah.
And I think it really is the one thing I think people need to do. I mean, this is where I wanted to, because I know Chris has another thing where he basically says that the ancient Greeks are basically, you know, semi-caved railing mystics. And we've progressed so beyond that today because he does have a Whiggish theory of history. And I'm like, in some sense that's true, but I would actually argue that so was Descartes, motherfucker.
Yeah.
like, and so am I. So like my cave's just gotten a lot nicer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think like we have to go back and make it weird, but like it is coherent. It does have a rationality, not the rationality. I don't know what that is, but a rationality. Once you figure out the first principles, you figure out the assumptions, you figure out how they're structuring their arguments, they do flow, except for the weird places where they don't, like pregnant women turn mirrors red, and our menstruating women turn mirrors red, and but there's a lot of weird biology.
I wrote a little short thing about how you get this coming up all sorts of Roman writers seem to talk about how there's a certain place in Portugal where wind can impregnate horses.
Okay.
And you can go, okay, that's really odd, but it has a really interesting sort of later relevance for the history of natural science, because when people were trying to propose a theory of pollination, they were saying, hey, well, if these ancient writers said that this works in the case of animals, it should also then work in the case of plants as well. So there's all sorts of weird ways in which this history is not as like irrelevant and obscure as it may seem. Okay, we're nearing the kind of 2 hour mark. I think we'll probably
let's cut it off here.
Start wrapping up. Definitely much more to say. I think
we can talk. You and I can probably talk about this all day. And I'm going to have you do. So in about 3 months, I'd like to ask you back on to actually just talk about Plotinus.
Sure.
And the relevance of Plotinus to European thinking, because weirdly today, the only people I know who talk about Plotinus are you weirdos in ancient philosophy and our Hellenistic philosophy, not like truly ancient philosophy, not pre-Socratics, and occultist, because they also really like Plotinus. And I don't. I'm not saying that the occultists are right. Although they're not entirely wrong either. I think it's interesting that he's been kind of dropped out of more mainstream philosophical discussion in ways that people that we have much less of, like people make a lot big. I mean, probably because of Nietzsche, but people make a big deal of Heraclitus. I'm like, we got like. I've read all of Heraclitus.
Yeah,
it's on 2 pages.
Yeah,
like, and then the anecdotes in like Diogenes Laertius and a few, but like that's what I got.
Yeah,
like,
I got it right here. This is a thick book, right? This is not. This is a lot to have from the ancient world. It's rare that you get this much from any singular thinker.
That's huge.
But the thing is, in some ways, the historiography of Plotinus is at some points more interesting than Plotinus itself. So love to talk about the sort of changing winds around how people think about Plotinus, why he's still kind of marginal, but in some sense, in my mind, why, in some ways, you can do your Plato and Aristotle, but you got to read your Plotinus. In no small part too, because you run to all these thorny things, you go, what on earth are they doing? I'm not gonna say Plotinus makes it clearer, but Plotinus at least gives you a very compelling reading of things. Then you go, even if I'm not committed to this, I hate how well this seems to make things fit together. So at least knowing the kind of live options for the historical interpretation can at least give you a good basis to at least do something different. But Plotinus, there's all sorts of fun things in Plotinus. We could probably do multiple podcasts on Plotinus. So I'd love to come back, chat about that for sure. I've
been doing more in philosophy. I've see a couple of people. I'm also talking to Chris Sator of I think the New Idealist or the young. I can't remember what he calls this show, but to get people more into understanding the broader context of this philosophy, because it's really easy for Marx to say, "Oh, we've solved philosophy because we know how stuff works." And I'm like, well, apparently you don't, though. I'm just like saying, like. The assumption that we have figured out what the world is and now we can change it. It did kind of presume that you figured out what the world is, and good luck with that. So on that note, thank you. Where can people find your work, Max?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I have my sort of academic stuff on my academia.edu, but most of the stuff I think the audience would be more interested in, and I have stuff out there kind of in circulation, but my Substack is really the kind of core central point. Some of the stuff we've talked about today will either on the Substack or will be forthcoming. Probably by the time this goes live, some of it will be. Right now, I'm working on a sort of series of essays on the principle of plenitude and like theories of, I guess, kind of like multiplicity in ancient philosophy and medieval receptions of it. A lot relating to questions of like, what does it mean to be materialist? What do we even mean by matter? Stuff like that. So the Substack, maxwade.substack.com. If you're interested in weird sort of speculative writing, some stuff on kind of like mysticism, philosophy, I'm going to have some creative writing stuff on there as well. But, you know, a lot of this stuff I'm really trying to use as an outlet where it's like, this is a little too weird for peer review, but I'm still trying to kind of think through threads in a way that I think a lot of people would find interesting. Even if it's not explicitly political, you won't have to sort of think too far to see where some of these connections might be. You know,
Yes.
There's a lot I think that your audience would definitely enjoy that I sort of write and think about. And so I'm having about 2 posts a month. I'm sort of see that for the foreseeable future. So if you're interested, it's free to subscribe, maxwade.substack.com.
Right. So you like me name things after yourself. Good man. So
when you're independent, you are your own brand, you know?
Thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed it. I'll definitely have you back. And I got to go back to reading horrible things and figuring out what's going on in the world. So I'm going to go do that. Take care, man.
We'll leave the cave. All right. Thank you very much for having me on.
All right.
All right. Take care.